Hey, like any very normal person, I caught myself wondering, what's the most viewed video by PragerU, the nonprofit with a YouTube channel that spends big on social media with its funding from fracking billionaires? Anyway, this is it, left or liberal, and this video has 18 million views, which is more than triple my record. When I saw the title, I was surprised because I always think of PragerU as conservative, and it's easy to forget that they brand themselves as quote-unquote classical liberals. I forgot that they're not the kind of people who don't know the difference between left and liberals, because they seem like they would be. But they do know the distinction, not because Dennis has any coherent understanding of the left, but because he understands his own position perfectly fine. He understands that conservatives and liberals are on the same team, the one he's on, the capital-loving team. So let's jump right into this video and see what Dennis might and might not understand.
What's the difference between a liberal and a leftist? This question stumps most people because they think liberal and left are essentially the same. But they're not. In fact, liberalism and leftism have almost nothing in common.
The first claim he makes is that most people are stumped by the question of what is the difference between the left and liberals. And people are stumped because, shockingly,
the left has appropriated the word liberal so effectively, almost everyone, liberals, leftists, and conservatives, thinks they are synonymous.
If you're wondering whether there's a source or even an example given for that inflammatory claim, you've never seen a PragerU video. In what ways have the left appropriated the word liberal? What is that even supposed to mean? No one who identifies with being on the left considers themselves a liberal or uses the term in positive ways. So in what ways has the left confused people about the meaning of the left and liberals? Dennis started with the very true premise that people are confused about the difference between leftists and liberals, but he a priori makes up that this fact is due to the left appropriating the word liberal and fooling people. I think it's due to the US having almost no prominent leftist politicians and a poor education system in general, but also especially when it comes to Marxist political economic theory. Well, no, actually the simplest answer is that when it comes down to it, people on the political right wing are often the ones abusing the term, as we've seen this election cycle with Biden and Harris, two absolute libs, being referred to literally as communists. The political right sees people discussing the difference between equality and equity, and they yell communism. Or take the current US president, who referred countless times to Democrats and the quote-unquote radical left as one and the same.
But they're not.
It'd be kind of brilliant if this was a planned way that these people had of shifting the overtone window so that barely leftist ideas are conceivable, but it's probably just a form of surefire clickbait designed to be seen as going against what is portrayed as the most extreme threat imaginable. So let's return to Dennis, who is beginning his 6-point list of examples of how leftists and liberals differ. The first point is regarding issues of race, which he says,
this is probably the most obvious difference between liberal and left.
We can only speculate as to the sources of this claim. We hear that liberals believe race is, quote, insignificant, and that, quote, those who think it's significant are racist. But the left, Dennis claims, considers race significant, focuses on race, cares too much about race. This is wrong in a multi-layered, confusing way that can feel oppressive to criticize because he framed the issue so completely wrong by insisting that differences on issues of race are the main differences between leftists and liberals.
This is probably the most obvious difference between liberal and left.
Or, I'm sorry, I guess he didn't say it was the main difference, he said it was the most obvious difference, which is weird and interesting. Also interestingly, in my detail-oriented opinion, is the fact that Dennis published an article a year before this video that's nearly the exact same as the script of this video. But one of the small changes is he has the word moral in this sentence here in the original, writing, race. This is perhaps the most obvious of the many moral differences between liberalism and leftism. He still moralizes in the video quite a lot, but I guess he decided that if he said the word moral too many times, some of the YouTube kids these days would, think he's kind of Lame. The main difference between leftists and liberals is obviously the socialism versus capitalism thing. Liberals consider capitalism pretty great, but just in need of some regulation, and the poor in need of a little welfare in order to clean the ruling class's conscience a bit, whereas the political left insists that capitalism is meant to lead to communism and that the structure of production relationships needs to be revolutionized in order for people to be free of the oppression of current labor relations. Don't get me wrong, differences between leftists and liberals when it comes to perspectives on issues related to race are extremely significant and important, like the fact that the left sees racism as inherent to the modern settler colonial state, while liberals are more likely to see racism as an individual character flaw or an individual bad law or policy. There are many more differences between how the left views issues related to race and how liberals do, but okay, Dennis's point is about this.
And liberals have always been passionately committed to racial integration, while the left is increasingly committed to racial segregation, such as all-black dormitories and separate black graduations at universities.
No, of course he doesn't give examples, don't even wonder. Let it be known that even in that article from a year earlier, there is no hyperlink or citation for these lines. Personally, I support schools providing spaces for black people and people of color, whether it's dorms or graduations or whatever, which it seems like many schools do actually provide supplementary graduation ceremonies for black students or undocumented students. People like Dennis object to this on the basis that it's segregation, but these are supplementary ceremonies. White students are not missing out on their graduation ceremony, and black students can still attend the same graduation ceremony as the white students, so it's in no way segregation, it's just the addition of another event. If we even accept the premise that these schools' decisions represent leftist ideology, I think it needs to be admitted that their actions don't oppose integration, but show an addition to integration. Moving on, Dennis makes his second point, which should have totally been his first point, which is differing perspectives on capitalism.
Liberals have always been pro-capitalism because liberals are committed to free enterprise and because they know capitalism is the only way to lift great numbers of people out of poverty. It is true that liberals want government to play a bigger role in the economy than conservatives do. But liberals never opposed capitalism, and they were never for socialism. Opposition to capitalism and advocacy of socialism are left-wing values.
Honestly, I don't know what to say. That was pretty on point. Maybe that should have been the whole video, just those 30 seconds. But Dennis goes on to his third point, which is much less of a strong point, and it's about differing perspectives on nationalism. Dennis tells us that liberals believe in the nation state, but the left opposes nationalism. He gives a weird example about how the writers of Superman changed from liberals to leftists over time and changed Superman from patriotic to anti-American.
The left has contempt for nationalism, seeing it as the road to fascism. Better that we should all be citizens of the world in a world without borders.
I don't know anything about Superman, but Dennis lumps together two distinct things in his discussion of nationalism here. One is the concept of borders, which he says leftists oppose, without giving a citation to this significantly controversial claim. And about that, while the left certainly advocates the coordination of workers internationally, there is still some debate about different perspectives among different people on the left with differing views about borders. But then the second concept that Dennis lumps in with this is national pride. Borders and national pride are certainly related, but they're not the same thing. It doesn't help this awkward sense of it being lumped in to have the next point be a redundancy. Point 4 is view of America, which has significant overlap with this point 3.5 we were just talking about of national pride and so on. So let's see what Denny Boy says.
Watch American films from the 1930s through the 1950s, and you will be watching overtly patriotic, America-celebrating films, virtually all produced, directed, and acted by liberals. Liberals were quite aware of America's imperfections, but they agreed with Abraham Lincoln that America is the last best hope of Earth. The left, however, believes the left is the last best hope of Earth, and regards America as racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, violent, and imperialistic.
He just goes on to point 5 here. He doesn't even try to argue that the US isn't xenophobic, violent, and imperialistic, and so on. He just relies on what he expects the audience's emotional reaction to be. And for at least 72,000 people, he's right. In my opinion, from a speechwriting perspective, he really shouldn't have included violent and imperialistic here, since those are kind of more objective and easily seen. By saying racist, sexist, and homophobic, and even xenophobic, I can imagine the fans watching saying, yeah, how ridiculous to call America those things. But when he finishes with violent and imperialistic, I really can't help but wonder if some fans watching thought, Dennis, I love you, but I think America has been a little violent and maybe even a little imperialistic here and there, if we're being, honest. But I'm just speculating here. And yeah, it's worth noting the hyperbole of Dennis's description of the left's position. If anyone ever asks my view of Prager and these Jordan Peterson types, my first point is how they misrepresent the views they're disagreeing with. And that's my first point because I believe it's very objectively observable and very objectively objectionable. A better description for Dennis would be to describe the left as viewing socialism as the last best hope of Earth because the left sees capitalism as plundering the world's resources and reducing increasing numbers of people to poverty. I mean, he can still disagree, but, at least present the rationale that you're disagreeing with. I'm doing my best here to present Dennis's views accurately because I believe in his free speech.
No one has been more committed than American liberals to the famous statement, "I wholly disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." But the left is leading the first widespread suppression of free speech in modern American history. From the universities, to the tech companies that govern the internet, to almost every other institution and place of work.
I know that was a long clip, but I just really like free speech. You may have found it odd how Dennis said that the left has significant influence over universities, tech companies, and, quote, almost every other institution and place of work. Imagine thinking the left has broad control over places of work in the US in 2021. But what I found really funny is the wording Dennis uses here when he says,
tech companies that govern the internet.
I know I shouldn't focus too much on a single word, but how coincidental is it that Dennis uses the word govern here to discuss the behaviors of a private corporation? Like, it's obviously the common general way we use the word govern, but it sticks out like a sore red thumb in a video by these people who make every issue about their supposed belief in small government. But my point here is this: Dennis actually needs the word govern here to make his point, because without it, it would be way more transparent that companies making decisions about community guidelines are doing so in their own fiduciary interests and not due to leftist political theory. But let's hear his brief attempt at explaining how leftists view free speech issues.
Of course, the left claims to only oppose hate speech. But putting aside the fact that the left deems hate speech anything it differs with, protecting what you or I might consider hate speech is the entire point of free speech.
No, Dennis, actually, I want to switch which claim we put aside, if you don't mind. Putting aside the fact that Dennis deems the, quote, entire point of free speech to be to protect hate speech, let's just look at his previous claim that, quote, the left deems hate speech anything it differs with. Do I even need to mention that Dennis doesn't provide any potential evidence to try to support this claim? If I do, I'm sorry, I'm not. I don't know what to say. There's no evidence. But it just leaves me wondering, is there really a problem nowadays with people using the term hate speech too broadly? Is that one of the problems we're facing nowadays? If you were asked, like, what problems exist, would people overusing the term hate speech be something you mention? If you answered yes to that, please explain in the comments below, which will give me engagement to help in the algorithm and also give me some explanation of this mystifying perspective. There are so many pressing problems right now, and I have a hard time understanding the overuse of the label hate speech to be one of them. And Dennis's point that leftists call anything they disagree with hate speech is completely undermined by his next point that free speech rights exist to protect hate speech. If free speech rights existed to protect hate speech, then why would it matter whether leftists considered everything they disagreed with hate speech? Well, because he tries to make two claims, and to say that leftists consider anything they disagree with hate speech while also not understanding that the purpose of free speech rights is to protect hate speech. No, I think neither of Dennis's claims are correct, so he puts them both forward to confuse us. And this also might be subconscious because he's confused, I don't know. I do know that free speech rights do not exist to protect hate speech. That is an outrageous claim. Hate speech is a necessary consequence of free speech rights, but it's not something to be protected. Hate against vulnerable groups will exist as long as there's ignorance and the transference of blame for people's material circumstances, but that hate speech isn't some sanctified thing in need of protection. Dennis is literally misusing the phrase hate speech. Nonetheless, it's a fact that people will probably always be able to spread hate speech on public platforms. If they do it too directly, then they get banned, which is the right of the company operating the platform. If they are unjustly banned, people will protest and the platform will change its mind due to material pressure. But people can express a lot of hate under the radar, and it will always exist on public platforms. For a good and very current study in free speech ethics, let's look at the freaking US president getting permanently suspended from Twitter last night. People seem to react in line with whether or not they like the president, but looking closer, my takeaway from looking at people's reactions on the left, from my limited perspective on Twitter, was it seemed that most people were supportive of Twitter's move, but many criticized Twitter taking so many years to do it, and a smaller group worried about the obvious implication that this censorship could and would be used against the left in other circumstances. The synthesis and the best perspective, in my opinion, was by Sean from YouTube, who said, "I see a lot of people celebrating Trump being banned, but I, for one, am very concerned about what this means for freedom of speech. Imagine a corporation exhibiting influence over a politician. Sounds impossible, no? Not anymore. Welcome to the new cyber reality." Other people made the same point in other ways, just getting it across that, yeah, obviously these platforms have been using their power forever in shaping their image and appeal and affecting policy. And if the power exists in the hands of private owners, shouldn't they use it to stop people from, say, inciting armed takeovers of the Washington Capitol? It's not some vague free speech issue. I think it was right for Trump to be kicked off of Twitter because he was inciting violence, in my perspective. And I think companies should enforce policies regulating incitement of violence on their platforms so fewer people experience violence. Call it a radical view, but it seems pretty normal. And if companies go too far and regulate things that don't cause harm, then people should have a problem with that. But my real point here, honestly, is again that Dennis doesn't adequately represent the views of the people he disagrees with. He doesn't even give the rationale for you to consider. Leftists argue that liberal tolerance of hate speech breeds the fascism that the world has already experienced in numerous forms. Allowing hate speech only makes a platform less accessible for the vulnerable groups, the hated groups, whether on social media or on a college campus. It's not pure positive freedom as people like Dennis claim, since it infringes on the freedoms of other people. Dennis leaves it unclear whether there are any circumstances in which he would limit someone's speech, though he does hang up on Not Even a Show when they prank call him. Check out my previous video for more on that. Anyway, I think libs pretty much were also happy that Trump was kicked off of Twitter, and I'm sure many liberals were also aware of this representing a potential freedom of speech concern, but it's hard to argue with the reasoning unless you're primed to support the MAGA mission no matter what. Speaking of which, the conservatives had quite hot takes, with their usual metaphors of 1984 and so on. Of course, without addressing that this is a private company, not the government, and not addressing the actual allegations also about the guy inciting violent insurrection with his raw posting skills. Okay, and the last point that Dennis attempts to make is about what he calls Western civilization.
Liberals have always championed and sought to protect Western civilization. Liberals celebrate the West's unique moral, philosophical, artistic, musical, and literary achievements, and have taught them at virtually every university. The most revered liberal in American political history, President Franklin Roosevelt, often cited the need to protect Western civilization and even Christian civilization. Yet when President Donald Trump spoke of the need to protect Western civilization in a speech in Warsaw, the left-wing media, also known as the mainstream media, denounced him. They argue that Western civilization is no better than any other, and that Western civilization is just a euphemism for white supremacy.
He loses a lot of credibility, in my opinion, by equating the left-wing media to the mainstream media, but he then goes on to claim that they both argued that Western civilization is, quote, no better than any other, and is also, quote, just a euphemism for white supremacy. I'm not going to argue those claims because I'm tired and he doesn't support them with any evidence, but just notice how distinct they are. Again, he presents two claims. First, that leftists find Western civilization no better than any other, which is relatively reasonable, and also that leftists find Western civilization to be just a euphemism for white supremacy, which is clearly a bit excessive, even if it certainly has a lot of truth to it. We're supposed to be like, well, one of those claims was a bit over the top, so I'm clearly supposed to disagree with both entirely. In fact, I think I'll think the opposite. Of course, Western civilization and white supremacy do have an important and intimate relationship, but Dennis apparently isn't ready for that conversation or to introduce any of those lines of thought. But we're almost done, and here's my favorite claim of the video. Dennis says this.
So then, if liberalism and leftism are so different, why don't liberals oppose the left? In a nutshell, because they have been taught all their lives to fear the right.
Wait, what? 1 second, play that back.
So then, if liberalism and leftism are so different, why don't liberals oppose the left?
Why don't liberals oppose the left? What? We're just supposed to treat that as a serious question? Of course liberals oppose the left. Buddy, you just spent your precious 5 minutes of your video talking about the differences between liberals and leftists, including the whopper of a difference with the capitalism-socialism one. So how are you gonna ask why don't liberals oppose the left? In the 2020 election, Bernie Sanders, one of the only slightly left candidates, had the other candidates consolidate against him by dropping out simultaneously. That was clearly liberalism opposing the slightest bit of leftism. And that's obviously just one example. So how are you gonna ask why don't liberals oppose the left? Oh, because I think what Dennis means is why are more and more kids these days into socialism and not subscribing to my YouTube channel, or something like that. Why don't people realize the existential threat of Bernie Sanders and AOC? It's an incoherent and unbelievable premise that liberals don't oppose the left. But then, of course, he completes the thought by saying that this is all because liberals have been taught to fear the right. He's saying, don't fear the right. Finally, Dennis cites a source. And who is it but none other than Alan Dershowitz, erstwhile associate of the late mass abuser Jeffrey Epstein. Dershowitz, who was Epstein's lawyer and flew on his plane, is someone Dennis Prager trusts for political advice. I would sarcastically say this video aged well, but Dershowitz has always been a scumbag. Dennis closes with the simple advice,
Dear liberals, conservatives are not your enemy. The left is. I'm Dennis Prager.
I personally don't trust people who are so direct about telling me how to feel and who to feel it about. If you're going to be afraid of the political left, at least try to learn what the left is actually about. Oh, and by the way, this Alan Dershowitz character is currently, right now, claiming that Trump's incitement of the riot on the Capitol during the certification process of his own lack of re-election was protected speech, and that he would represent Trump in a court about that. If this is your noble champion of free speech and of liberalism, I would argue you're using the concepts of free speech and liberalism to mask cynical, opportunistic motives. And I honestly think Dennis was projecting by saying that people don't understand the difference between left and liberal because of the left appropriating the term liberal. Dennis has used his platform to appropriate the term liberal to make people more happy with what we consider conservative values. But look, Dennis and Alan are right about leftist thought being a threat to their power. They're both capitalists. But it's of course dishonest to suggest that the same is true of the audience. With such a wide range of people watching, 18 million of them, statistically, the vast majority are exploited for their labor and would also benefit materially from socialism. Oh, also, isn't it weird how we didn't get a history of the terms at all? Like, no discussion of what the words mean. My understanding is that liberal comes from the 19th century UK party opposing the Tories and the Whigs, and the economic theory of free markets dating back to Adam Smith, and that the origin of the term the left goes back to the French Revolution, when supporters of royal power sat to the right of the president and those who wanted more change sat on the left. It would have been nice for Dennis to maybe mention where the terms came from, to just, ground his analysis. One last thing before we stop. Many of the top comments are that the liberals are considered right-wing in most other countries. This is true, expected, and in agreement with Dennis's point. While agreeing with Dennis's point about the connections between liberals and conservatives, these comments also reset the overtone window by saying, no, it's not just that liberals have a lot in common with conservatives, Dennis. Liberals are conservatives in many ways. Because of Dennis's biases, he doesn't seem to have ever been able to grasp critiques of capitalism in any depth. And as he uses his platform to make statements about how socialism leads to breadlines, he misses the fact that we already have breadlines. People are needlessly dying in a system where their needs aren't being met, while private property rights are prized to the benefit of inherited wealth. Personally, I value the amelioration of human suffering over the abstract supposed value of freedom from taxation or regulation on businesses polluting or other exploitive actions, just like I value the material benefit of preventing some hateful speaker from talking on a given platform where they can cite hatred and violence, rather than the abstract supposed value of freedom of speech no matter what. The material circumstances always have to be looked at, and let's just say Dennis's analysis is lacking in this way. There, we looked at the most viewed PragerU vid and we made it through, right? If you liked this, you might also like this other video I did about the Prague, or this one I did about the Prague, and it's also possible you would like this one about that guy Steven Crowder. I also make videos about other things that don't involve right-wing rhetoric. Like I have videos where I'm just walking around filming trees you might kind of enjoy. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe and share it with your coolest friends. And you can support the channel on Patreon if you want to do that for some extra videos and music. All right, thanks.